The opening scenes of Neil Jordan's Undine show Ireland floating on the sea surrounded by ancient magical energies. At some point the supernatural will intrude on the daily routine of a melancholy scruffy-haired fisherman called Syracuse, Colin Farrell, and this is made clear as the camera focuses on his boat. The lovely amphibian female, Alicia Bacletta, appears in the shape of an unexpected catch which the fisherman accepts with a shrug of his shoulders. When Undine is on board Syracuse's fishing boat, she sings a siren song and his nets and lobster pots are bursting at the seams with fish and seafood in unbelievable quantities. However, Syracuse is skeptical of good luck, believing that it will bring bad luck. Is Undine a true Selkie? Will she remain? And can love be trusted? What exactly is Undine's true secret? And who is the menacing man who is stalking her around town? Is her Selkie spouse returning her to the sea? This film tells the Syracuse is a fisherman from a little village on Ireland's coast. One afternoon, a mysterious and gorgeous as she wades into the river, a girl called Undine becomes entangled in his nets. On the boat, Undine seems to bring Syracuse good luck by attracting fish to his nets. What exactly is her name? Let us investigate Undine. This story begins in the Irish Sea. Syracuse, a fisherman, is out at sea. When the fishing net was pulled, he had no idea he would catch a gorgeous woman amid the fish pile. Syracuse instantly saved the woman by doing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The woman then coughed up, having ingested a lot of water. She was still alive. Syracuse called for assistance, but the lady stated that she was all right and did not want to see anybody else. But she could not recall her name. Finally, Syracuse did not contact the police and brought the woman to an empty house that used to belong to his late mother. Syracuse then left her alone since he had a pressing task. Syracuse went to his ex-wife's place. Syracuse arrived to pick up his daughter Annie and transport her to the hospital. Annie had renal failure, so she had to travel to the hospital every week for dialysis. Syracuse shares a story while waiting for his daughter to complete dialysis. The story was about a fisherman who discovered a gorgeous woman in his fishing net. Annie was surprised to learn that she could use the hospital's electric wheelchair. Syracuse drove Annie back to her mother's house. Alex is Maura's boyfriend. Maura and Alex frequently get drunk. Syracuse was planning to go fishing the next day. Then he ran into the lovely lady he had met the day before. The woman asked Syracuse to take her fishing. Syracuse inquired about the woman's identity once more. She then explained that her name is Undine, which means girl from the water. Syracuse unfortunately caught very few fish. Undine suddenly began to sing in a melodious voice. When Syracuse lifted his net, he was astounded to see so many massive lobsters. Undine's singing, it appears, brought him good fortune. His catch that day was massive. When they return to the island, Syracuse invites Undine to come to town to sell their catch, but Undine refuses because she does not want to meet anyone except Syracuse. Undine dashed back to her house. After selling the lobster, Syracuse goes to the clothing store to look for clothes for Undine. He then went to Annie's school to pick up his daughter. That's when Annie challenges her father to a race home. On the way, Annie asked Syracuse to continue his story. According to Annie, the woman in her father's fairy tale is Selkie. Selkie is a mythological character who is a seal that can transform into a human. Syracuse went home after dropping Annie off at Maura's house. Annie, on the other hand, is intrigued by her father's fairy tales and decides to accompany him home. Syracuse went back to his late mother's house. He then lavished Undine with food and new clothes. Undine was overjoyed to receive all of the presents. She then kissed Syracuse on the cheek. Syracuse exited, his face flushing. Meanwhile, Annie suspects her father is hiding something at her grandmother's house. She then visits the library to learn more about Selkies. The next day, a curious Annie decides to visit her late grandmother's house. She saw a woman swimming in the ocean there. That was the first time Annie and Undine met. Annie was certain that the woman in front of her was a Selkie and not a human. The two then talked a lot, but Annie turns out to know a lot about Undine and why she chose to stay on land instead of at sea. She was certain that Undine had misplaced her coat. She could not return to the ocean without the coat. According to legend, Undine and Annie later became friends. The scene shifts to a man looking out at the vast ocean. Surely the man is looking for something. Syracuse invited Undine to go sailing with him again the next day. On the boat, Syracuse teaches Undine how to drive. However, in the middle of the ocean, a marine officer passed them. Undine was terrified and immediately hid. Then she drives with her feet. Syracuse was made uneasy by Undine's sexy legs. Undine then resumed her humming, and surprisingly, Syracuse's net was now catching so many fish. In fact, he had never caught so many fish before. However, the marine officers stopped at the ship because they were suspicious of Syracuse's large catch. They suspected Syracuse of using a prohibited net. The officers also searched the boat's compartment for Undine, who was hiding there. Undine informs them that Syracuse catches the fish with a regular Finally, the officers left. Syracuse invites Undine to go to the market and sell the fish. Undine agreed to accompany Syracuse to the market because other people had seen her. That is when the mysterious man noticed Undine in the distance. Meanwhile, when they arrived on the mainland, the other fishermen were astounded to see such a beautiful woman. Syracuse made a lot of money selling his fish at the fish market. They then went into town and took Annie. Undine is busy shopping for new clothes while some women stand outside the store watching her. They were awestruck by Undine's beauty. Annie paid Undine a visit the next day. Undine decides to teach Annie to swim in the sea. She discovered her lost seal coat at the bottom of the sea. Annie suggested burying her coat in the ground in order to live on land for another 7 years. Annie, it turns out, read the story from a library book. They then went to bury the coat in the garden behind the house. Syracuse takes Undine and Annie to a town festival in the afternoon. Annie tells Undine the Selkie legend and asks her to admit that she is a Selkie, but Undine denied it. The mysterious man seemed to be looking for Undine in the middle of the festival by the sea. When Annie arrives at the festival, she still forces Undine to admit she is a Selkie. Annie drove her wheelchair quickly and jumped into the sea because she did not confess. Without thinking, Undine dashed into the sea. Annie informed her father that Undine could breathe underwater. Annie was driven home and Syracuse drove Undine back to her late mother's house. Syracuse then tells her that he used to be an alcoholic. That is why he did not get custody of Annie. He decided to change for the sake of his daughter. That night the two got carried away and began having sex. Surprisingly, Undine enjoys her time with Syracuse. Syracuse went to church the next day and told everyone about Undine. He began to be concerned about losing Undine. He encounters the mysterious man outside the church. The gentleman inquired about Undine. Undine, according to Syracuse, is a woman who brings him good luck. Syracuse accompanied Annie to dialysis therapy again that day. They were unable to locate Maura after returning from the hospital. So Annie took her father to a bar. Sure enough, Maura and Alex were getting drunk while playing billiards. Syracuse requested that Annie stay at his house, but Maura refused. She even invited Syracuse to come home to meet his mermaid. Undine was sleeping when she heard the sound of a car approaching. It turns out that the mysterious man came to look for her. Syracuse was shocked when he returned home because his house was falling apart as if someone had damaged it. He went looking for Undine right away and found her on the riverbank. The mysterious man turns out to be her husband who came looking for her. Syracuse asked her to make a wish for her husband to leave. Annie told him that if she made a wish, all of her wishes would be granted, but Undine wanted to make a wish for Annie to recover from her illness. Undine's words had an impact on Syracuse. Meanwhile, the mysterious man is looking for Undine in the middle of the city. At the same time, Maura, who was inebriated, was on her way home with Annie and Alex. Unfortunately, the two cars collided, resulting in an accident. Alex was even thrown dying on the spot. At the time, Syracuse, who was driving Undine to town, witnessed the accident. He was terrified when he realized it was Maura's car. Fortunately, Annie survived the collision. Syracuse is informed at the hospital that Annie requires immediate kidney transplant surgery. Alex turns out to have kidney tissue that is identical to Annie's. Undine met her injured husband at the hospital. Her husband invites her to come home with him, but Undine has one condition. She did not want him interfering with her life again. Annie's surgery went smoothly. Surprisingly, it was all thanks to Undine's prayer for Annie's recovery. The next day, Syracuse and Maura scattered Alex's ashes in the ocean. Maura then agreed to let Syracuse care for Annie on one condition: Undine is unable to be with him. That night, Maura forces Syracuse to accompany her to the bar for a drink. Syracuse initially refused, but Maura persisted until he finally agreed. Syracuse had been drinking all night. He then looked for Undine, who was hiding on his boat. He took her to an island with a lighthouse. There are numerous seals on the beach. Syracuse compelled Undine to travel to the island. He then left her alone, still inebriated. When Undine realized what was going on, he immediately pursued Syracuse's boat. She was devastated because she had to say goodbye to him. Humans and Selkies, according to Syracuse, cannot coexist. When night fell, Undine removed her shoes and coat. She then jumped into the sea and swam. That night, Syracuse went to Annie's house to pick her up. Annie inquired as to where Undine was. His father stated that Undine was gone for an extended period of time. Annie was convinced Undine would return because she had left something the morning Annie is watching television. Syracuse notices that the song the man sings is the same song that Undine frequently sings. He recognized his folly. It turns out that the song is not an imaginary song and Undine is not a fairy tale character. He immediately went to the island with the lighthouse. Unfortunately, Undine was not found. He became aware of Undine's shoes and coat, and he could see her on the other side of the island. He dashed for the island. Undine was lying in the cold. Syracuse hugged her tightly. Finally, Undine reveals the truth about herself. She turned out to be a drug dealer from Romania. Together with his partner Vladik, they brought a large amount of heroin to be smuggled. However, the Coast Guard witnessed their actions to avoid the officers' ambush. Undine dove into the sea. Meanwhile, Vladik was arrested because he could not swim. However, Undine was swept away by the waves and drowned. It is when she was caught in Syracuse's net and saved. At night, Syracuse returned Undine to his home. However, there were uninvited guests. Syracuse and Vladik got into a fight. Unfortunately, Vladik is not alone. His friend approached him and immediately pointed a gun at him. Meanwhile, Vladik begs Undine to give up all of his order to save Syracuse, and his daughter Undine reveals the location of the heroine. But when Vladik dug around in the backyard garden, he could not find it. Annie had removed the coat containing the heroine. Annie still believes Undine is a sulky, and she hides her coat so that Undine can live with them forever. Finally, Annie stated that the coat was in the lobster trap. They returned to the boat and landed on the lobster trap. When Undine realized Vladik could not swim, she pushed him into the sea. Vladik died in the end because he was trying to get the heroine in the lobster trap. The cops arrested Vladik's colleague and took Undine to the station. Syracuse returned to the priest the next day to talk. The priest informs Syracuse that Undine will be deported. She can, however, remain in Ireland if she marries and becomes an Irish citizen. Finally, Syracuse requested that the priest bless them in their marriage, and he helped them both get married. The little family is now the end. Love triumphs over all.